Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming back for the sixth and final part of Each Other's Business. Just a little note, I wrote this story last summer in this frenzy of story writing. I wrote 8 stories in 9 weeks, and I was able to access things I've never really accessed before in fiction writing. I feel I was in my fiction writing. But I'm not an autobiographical writer. I don't think of my life and sit down and try to transcribe what happened to me. If someone was to ask me what part of Each Other's Business came from my life, I'd have to say that all of it's true, but I made all of it up. I'm not sure if that makes sense, but it is all true, but I made all of it up. Here's part 6. Annie held the edges of her folding chair. They were all together for Jason's bridging ceremony. He was going from Webelos to Boy Scouts. All around were blue and gold scout banners hung in the church basement, and all of the boys were in their uniforms. She recognized some of the kids from school, but mostly they were unfamiliar and rowdy. The boys from Cub Pack 1542 sat in rows up front and scratched and fidgeted and tugged on their yellow kerchiefs and leaned into each other and tried to suppress giggles. 2 older boys in green uniforms sat there up front too, but they sat straight, and their neckerchiefs were tightly rolled and fell down the backs of their shirts in precise triangles. Annie wondered how they stayed so still. The pastor gave the invocation, and then the scoutmaster talked about the different ideals of scouting, and then a den mother gave out special awards to boys who had done projects. Annie sat between her 2 families. On her left were her father and stepmother. Her stepmother had recently cleaned out the bedroom where Annie slept. The stacks of dusty boxes and old family photos had been moved to the garage and stacked there in the rafters with a lot of other boxes that belonged to her father and contained stuff that he said no one would use again in a million years, and he couldn't for the life of him understand why he was keeping things and then stacking more boxes on top of them that were also stuffed full of things that no one would use in a million years, and the whole thing was like a graveyard, he said, and that someday he'd clear it out or burn it down, whichever was easier. After they'd moved the boxes, Annie and her stepmother, who she called by her first name, cleaned the room. They dusted and wiped clean the baseboards and took down the blinds and sprayed them with a hose and covered the mattress and pillows with cases that caught the dust so that Annie's allergies wouldn't act up, and brought in a chair from the basement and cleaned out the desk of craft supplies and generally made the room Annie's, which she appreciated. The best thing about the room were the curtains, which Denise sewed herself from blue fabric. Annie picked the fabric herself from a remnant bin at the fabric store. They were blue with stars. Annie said she liked them because even if it was cloudy, she could look at the curtains and imagine a clear night sky. Annie looked over Denise's shoulder while she worked at the sewing machine. The machine was complicated, but Denise's fingers threaded the needle and bobbin and set the switches, and then she was sewing like it was nothing she had to think about. And the needle started going like magic, and Annie said, "How do you make it go?" And Denise pointed to the floor, where her foot rested on a little pedal that she used to control the speed. "How do you know how to do it?" Annie said. Denise said, "My mama taught me how when I was very little, near your age, and I've been doing it ever since. That's how I make a living. Did you know that?" Annie didn't know anything about Denise before this. When the curtains were finished, they took them to her room and hung them, and Denise then left her alone in the room while she went to do other chores, and Annie liked that she had a room here all to herself, and that Jason still had to share his room with Denise's sewing table and tools. Jason didn't like her coming into his room at their mother's, and he often kept the door closed and put signs on it that said, "Keep out," and "Trespassers beware." And even so, she'd sneak in there when she could and lie on the carpet-swatched floor and stare at the pictures of the motorcycles on the wall and the lady in the bikini who was also tacked up there. Her mother sat on her right along with Mitzi, who was invited because Gary was working second shift, and her mother said she wanted someone to talk to that wasn't a friend of Derek's. She'd made a change concerning Annie's bedroom, too. After her car burned up, she let Annie sleep on the divan and then said, This is your room now, because you need your own room. And even though the room they used to call the living room had no windows, they'd bought sets of paisley sheets at the Goodwill and tacked them to the ceiling and walls, and Denise had donated some sheer curtains that she no longer used, that they bunched up and ran in lines from the ceiling's center fixture. It was like shimmering sunlight shooting out from her room to the rest of the world. They moved the divan against the wall and unpacked several baskets of old clothes from a trunk that she now used as a dresser. There were no sheets that fit the divan right, but Annie loved it anyway. She said it made her feel like a fancy lady. They moved her bed from the bedroom into the room too, but she never slept in it. She used it for her stuffed animals, which she kept lined in rows, according to a complex system of family connections that the adults didn't understand, despite her patient explanation of how it worked to anyone who asked. She'd point out, for instance, that the horse and the ostrich, though different on many levels, were part of the same family because she could ride them both, and they both had long necks and tough feet, and they got along well, and that's why they needed to sit next to each other. According to Gary, her system was a dynamic one, and he said he was happy to see her get her own fancy room, though he would miss the divan. Yes, she said, the fancy couch is now mine. But even though she liked the new space, it was still not like having a room with 4 walls and a door. At night, they now watched TV in her mother's room, where they'd moved the couch, and when Gary came over, he'd peek his head through the curtains and say, "Hey, little one, sweet dreams," and then he'd go down the hall and into the kitchen to eat the plate that was kept warm for him, and then go across the hall to her mother's room, and they'd close the door. She wasn't supposed to stay up late, but it was easy to lie in there on the divan with the curtains swaying with the breeze from the oscillating fan and listen to the house. She could hear Mitzi walking around upstairs and sometimes calling people on her phone late at night and sometimes crying. And sometimes she could hear the neighbor kids jumping into their pool late and playing loud music until some grown-up shouted at them to turn it down, for Christ's sake. What are you trying to do, wake up the whole neighborhood? And sometimes Jason would get up and walk through the rooms quietly and look out the sliding glass doors like he was maybe expecting someone. After a bit, he'd leave and find the toilet, and sometimes she'd hear from very far away the sounds of her mother's laughter, very faint and foreign, but good. On other nights, she'd wake and not remember where she was, and the swaying curtains looked like ghosts, and even once she'd remembered who she was and where she was and realized that there were no ghosts, she couldn't shake the images or get back to sleep, so she'd go down the hall with her pillow and blanket. Her mother's door was often closed, and that was okay because she liked going into her brother's room and standing over him while he was sleeping until he felt her watching him and opened his eyes and said, "What is it?" And she'd say, "I saw ghosts again," even though she was awake and knew it was only curtains, and he'd say, "Do you want to sleep here?" And she'd say, "Yes." And sometimes she'd climb into the bed with him, and they'd both fall instantly back to sleep, and sometimes she'd say yes and lay down on the floor, spreading her fingers out against the different textures of the carpet, and although she couldn't fall right to sleep there on the floor, that was okay too, because she could continue listening to everything there was to listen to, like her brother's steady and easy breathing or the sounds of cars passing on the street. This was the first time they'd all come together for anything since the last hearing, where the judge divided custody the way he did and set in motion the way they were living. Both Annie's mother and father were dressed up more than usual, and neither one of them talked to the other adults the way they did when they were separate, but they weren't arguing, and had even greeted each other politely, her mother shaking hands with Denise, and her father shaking hands with Mitzi, and all of them agreeing to sit together at the table near the front so that they'd have a good view of Jason when he crossed the bridge from Cub Scouts to Boy Scouts, and the leader gave him a new neckerchief, and he was welcomed by the older boys who crossed over before him. An older scout read the bridging statement, and then the Cub Scouts recited the law of the pack, which seemed to be about Indians and wolves, and they all held their hands over their hearts and said the pledge, and when they sat back down, Annie looked at her mother and father and saw that they were trying, best as they could, to be happy and proud, and to not get in each other's business, which was a phrase both of them used when they were worried about their business or what other people thought of their business, though she hadn't really understood what any of the business talk actually meant until this moment, surrounded by blue and gold bunting in a room full of families, and the Cub Scout leader talking, and everyone listening, even the fidgety and stupid boys up front, everyone except, it seemed, Annie, who was looking around at the grown-up faces and smelling the smells of the potluck table that was full of casseroles and cakes and crock-pots and cookies, all the food you could imagine, and hearing the sounds of her own stomach, which was rumbling, and noticing how the rumbles spread out through her body to let her know it was time to eat, and pressing her fingers to her belly and feeling her hunger, and then everyone was applauding, and the boy stood up, and goodness, she was hungry, and walked to the front and crossed over a little bridge decorated with pictures of bears and wolves and fleur-de-lis. And Jason was next, moving from one side to the other, and even though he looked like the same boy, even though all that really changed was the color of his neckerchief, she could tell he was different. And tell they were all different. Her mother clapping like she never clapped before, and her father taking pictures. Both Denise and Mitzi smiling and clapping too, glad to be part of it all. Then the boys recited their new oath, committed to their new beginnings, and everything seemed so different, but good. And then everyone stood, Annie knew, because they were all very hungry and very anxious for the feast. Thanks for coming to listen to this story.